Good evening, everyone. My name is Sharon Bryce. I'm the City Councillor for Ward 7, so I want to welcome you here tonight. I just have some official notes to go through, so I'll go put my glasses on so I can actually read them to you. So, thank you all for being here tonight on this balmy Regina evening. Everybody loving the weather? Yay! Yeah. So, we're here to hear from you tonight for this important initiative to redraft the city's zoning bylaw, which has been led by the Zone Forward team. Let's hear it from the Zone Forward team. Give us a wave, you guys. Yay. So that's our team. So Zone Forward was initiated in 2016 to comprehensively review and redraft Regina's existing zoning bylaw. The city has the statutory requirement to update the zoning bylaw to align with our recently approved official community plan. So you guys may have heard of the OCP. That's what they're talking about. It's also known as Design Regina. The city has changed significantly over the past number of years, so we need the new zoning bylaw that not only affects current development practices, but also facilitates future development. Myself, Diana, and the rest of the staff present feel that this is not only important that you understand how this is a proposed new bylaw and how it could impact you, but that you have the opportunity to give us your feedback. That's why we're here tonight. Let me say that again. Our primary reason for being here this evening is to listen to you. That's what's important to us. This bylaw will be coming forward to council in June 2019. So we want to provide residents with plenty of opportunities for feedback that will help us shape Regina. This bylaw is in draft form. That's why we're here to get input from you. It's only in draft right now. It is not set in stone, so I encourage all of you to share your thoughts with us tonight and over the coming months. I will now turn it over to Diana and her team to walk you through tonight's presentation. Thank you again, for everybody, for being here.
Thanks, Councillor Bryce, and good evening, everybody. I'm Diana Howrlick. I'm the Executive Director of City Planning and Community Development. So this project's been in the works for a while, and we really appreciate you guys coming out because we're really excited to talk to you about the project and how it affects you. If you don't know what a zoning bylaw is, that's okay. We're going to talk a little bit this evening, but it's one of those bylaws that touch every single citizen, whether they know it or not, because it gives the rules to how development takes place in our city and how we see our city grow. So we're going to talk a little bit for the next 45 minutes, but we're not here just talking at you. We really do, as Councillor Bryce said, want to hear from you. We're going to keep putting that message out because it is in draft form, and the feedback we're going to get from these sessions and from what we're getting online and in writing and all of those things, we're going to take all of that feedback to put another draft together. So it's really important that we hear your concerns and share how the zoning bylaw is impacting your neighborhood currently, and to see if the new zoning bylaw draft is addressing those concerns. So the city adopted its official community plan, as Councillor Bryce said, back in 2013. And the OCP, how many people have heard of the official community plan? Just raise your hands. A few of you? Awesome, that's great. So it sets the long-term growth priorities for the city and how we're going to grow. And it is the comprehensive policy framework to guide the physical, environmental, economic, social, and cultural development of the city. The one bylaw that really implements this is the zoning bylaw. It is the primary tool to implement the development within the city. So it's the framework, or the zoning bylaw is what we need to help institute the OCP. The existing bylaw was adopted in 1992. So it's quite old. It's had lots of revisions over the years, just because it's an operational bylaw, so it gets updated a number of times throughout the year. But there's been no comprehensive zoning bylaw review since the 70s. So this is really important. And in that time, Regina has seen significant growth, as we've seen building forms have changed and construction practices have evolved, and people's needs for housing types and commercial and industrial has evolved. So we want to make sure we address that. And this needs to be reflected in the new zoning bylaw, and also it needs to all align with our goals of our OCP. So although we're saying it's a comprehensive review, a lot of what is in the proposed bylaw, the foundations of the regulations are founded in the existing bylaw. Because at this point, there's a lot of good things in it, and just some things where we need to come up to regulations and be more proactive. So I'm just gonna kick it off by starting with a video that I'd ask you all to watch.
The city is updating its zoning bylaw. But what does this really mean for you and your neighborhood? Here's a quick lesson on what zoning is and why it's important to everyone. Zoning determines the most ideal locations for development, taking into account things like transportation networks, nearby businesses and residential neighborhoods, and land conditions such as areas that are prone to flooding. Zoning facilitates community growth by regulating broad land use categories for how land can be used. These include residential, commercial, industrial, and recreational. In other words, zones are like puzzle pieces, each relating to a type of land use. When all of those pieces are put together, they form the city we live in. As with puzzle pieces, each zone has unique characteristics, yet each is made to connect and fit with the pieces around it. Zoning also regulates the types of buildings that can be built and where they can be located on a property, which also includes development standards for a building such as lot area, lot width, building height, and how far a building must be set back from the property line. Zoning also impacts specific parking and landscaping and the requirements for other structures on the property. Zoning bylaws help us create livable, vibrant communities. For this reason, zoning touches on all aspects of our daily lives and the spaces we interact with in the city. Your vision for our city helps shape our official community plan, Design Regina, which provides long-term growth policies and development goals for the future. Now, the zoning bylaw will help us move closer to making that vision a reality over the next 25 years. We want to be Canada's most vibrant, inclusive, attractive, and sustainable community, where people live in harmony and thrive in opportunity. The zoning bylaw fosters the development of complete neighborhoods, where residents of all ages have the access they need to housing, work, and services that enhance their quality of life. This means providing flexibility for diverse types of housing and businesses to share space in new and existing neighborhoods, while also ensuring the unique character of each neighborhood is supported. For most neighborhoods, if there are changes, they'll be gradual and will happen over a long period of time. The zoning bylaw is just one of many tools used by municipalities to realize city building goals and objectives. If you have questions about zoning, contact us today.
Great, so now that you have a better understanding of zoning, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Miller, the manager of city projects, who's in charge of this project, to go over the proposed changes for the bylaw and how it impacts the residents in your neighborhood.
Thanks, Diana. Good evening, everyone. Again, thank you for coming out and talking about this enthralling subject that is zoning. Just to kind of break the ice a bit, you might be wondering why I'm wearing like the Steve Jobs like headset. Like, am I super important? Am I trying to be super important? This is our 8th session. And so we've tried a number of different technologies when it comes to amplifying our voice. And we found that this one works the best for me. I don't drop it. I don't rustle it against my necklace. I don't drop it. We've had that situation. So it's just easier for me to engage with you and talk to you like a normal person, because over the course of my career, I found that that's what really resonates with people, is when you're transparent and honest. And so this makes me feel like I'm getting down there with you and talking about how zoning impacts your property. So, the new zoning bylaw. Let me start off by saying that it's worth noting that the day after this bylaw is adopted, a switch is not going to get flipped, and everything in the community that you know and love is suddenly going to go up in smoke. At least that's not our intention. Everything that you know and love about your neighborhood is still going to be there the day after. So that restaurant you take your mom and dad to for dinner on Sunday nights, it's still going to be there. That place that you love to go to for coffee on the weekend, during the week, still going to be there. So we're not making sweeping changes that will drastically change the way your neighborhood looks. What we're trying to accommodate here is what new development will look like. How can we ensure that it is helping us meet our growth objectives moving forward while still being respectful to the existing community and the foundations of the City of Regina? So we're going to talk about 4 key ways that this new zoning bylaw is trying to accomplish those things. Then we're going to talk about Ward 7 specifically. What are some of the key changes that you can expect and how they might impact your property or not? What I will say is that if you are not planning any major development on your property in the next 5, 10, 15 years, if you've lived in your house in this community for the last 20 years and you don't plan on making any changes anytime soon, these regulations aren't going to impact you. These regulations will apply to new development. So if you're making a substantial renovation, alteration, addition to a property, once this new zoning bylaw is adopted, these rules will apply. So the key changes that we're going to talk about to kick things off are land use, mixed-use development, how this new zoning bylaw is helping us to develop complete neighborhoods, and how we're dealing with neighborhood transformation. So, the first thing to note with this new zoning bylaw is that we will have fewer zones. That's what's being proposed in this draft. Now, when we talk about zones, everyone might not be familiar with what exactly we're talking about. So just so that everybody's on the same playing field, when we say a zone, we're speaking of a classification type that's applied to a particular parcel of land, and that classification outlines the the development standards, the land uses, the requirements for subdivision of that particular property. Now, there are various types of zones. There are residential zones, there are mixed-use zones, there are industrial zones, and then there are some special zones that we've reserved for use for special reasons, and we'll talk a little bit about that. What you will notice in this proposed zoning bylaw is we have significantly consolidated the amount of zones that we have. We currently have 188 land use zones in the City of Regina. What we found over the course of the project that when we look at what some of those zones deliver on the ground, we're not seeing significant differences in that development. So what we've seen, for example, we have 3 what we call local commercial zones. And when you actually go out on the ground, go out into those areas, take pictures of each of those zones and put them all on the wall. What we found is that all 3 of those zones were giving the same kind of strip mall every time. So we asked ourselves, why do we need 3 zones to get us a strip mall? Maybe those 2 other zones could be used to get other types of development. So this really got us thinking about how we can make the zoning bylaw easier for us to administer as well as for residents to use. So we're going to be going from 188 zones to the proposed 43. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we were able to accomplish that. So here's an example. These are the 12 residential zones that you can currently find within our zoning bylaw. There are 12. Now, if you really think about it, kind of drive around the city, even drive around your ward, and think about, do you really see 12 distinct, very different types of housing in the community, in your neighborhood? And if not, then do we need 12 different zones to accomplish that? And so when we were looking at what we were going to propose in this new zoning bylaw, we looked at what are the zones saying they're supposed to be doing. We actually went out and looked to see what they were actually doing. And then we tried to line them up with what our OCP says they're supposed to be doing. And what we found is that there were a lot of opportunities for us to consolidate. We were able to accomplish just as many OCP policies with fewer land use zones. So on the residential side, we're proposing to go from 12 down to 5. So we have 5 very specific zones that will get us very specific development results, and those results don't necessarily overlap. So what we found in our existing zoning bylaw is that a number of the zones allow for the same types of development, and so they compete with each other. And so what we're proposing with this draft is that the zones are more specific about what it is we want to get, and that they align with the OCP. The next thing that you'll notice in this proposed zoning bylaw is this term mixed use. Now, this is a term that's used quite regularly in the official community plan, and that's why you're going to see it in the zoning bylaw. So just to make sure that everybody's clear, under the Planning and Development Act here in Saskatchewan, every municipality is required, under law, after they've adopted a new OCP, to ensure alignment with the zoning bylaw aligns with the OCP. So that's a statutory requirement. So when we're hearing these words like mixed use, complete neighborhoods, these are all terms that are in our OCP and therefore need to be reflected in our zoning bylaw. So when we're talking about mixed use, we're talking about whether it be in one building or on a site where there are multiple uses, whether they be commercial, institutional, maybe employment, but also have a residential component. And what this will help us to achieve is one of the other key themes that you'll see in our OCP, which is that of complete neighborhoods. So when we're talking about complete neighborhoods, like, what is that? Basically, it's a neighborhood where you can get the bulk of your basic needs met without having to leave. So ultimately, the Regina of the future, we want you to be able to get a liter of milk maybe 2 or 3 blocks away from you. We want you to be able to have access to a daycare not far from home. We want you to be able to age in place. And what we mean by age in place is that if you've been a member of this community for the last 25 years, but your house doesn't quite fit your needs anymore, maybe it's a little too big, maybe you need to downsize, but the neighborhood really doesn't have very many options for you. That's what we want to try to shift. We want to ensure that if you want to stay in your neighborhood, you can. So that's what we mean by complete neighborhoods. When we put those together, we want to include more uses, and we want to make them complete, easier for you to navigate, as well as to have your needs met. Now, with this said, as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to flip a switch and everything's going to be different in your neighborhood. But this is where we start to have that conversation about how does your neighborhood shift over the next 25 years. We're not saying that we're trying to make radical changes to your neighborhood, but we do also have to acknowledge that Regina is changing, Regina is growing, and how can we accommodate that growth and that change in a respectful way? So on this point, if your ward, which we'll see shortly, is primarily residential, the conversation we're going to need to have, not just through this process, but in some of the upcoming planning processes, is where would more mixed uses, where would the amenities that you would need to make your neighborhood complete go? Now, in some communities, they're primarily residential. So we're not suggesting that we're going to come in and knock down people's houses, but over the next 25 years, where does it make sense for us to create some of these commercial or mixed-use hubs within smaller neighborhoods? Finally, the last thing that you'll notice in this proposed zoning bylaw has to do with infill. Now, we've heard from residents that this has become a bit of a sensitive subject. This is our 8th session, so we've gone through wards 1 and we're now at ward 7. So we've heard in some neighborhoods that this is a concern. And so what we are proposing in this draft bylaw is regulations to address some of those concerns. So what we've heard is that is everyone familiar with what infill is? Oh, yes. Okay, hands are up. Okay, we're all down with the program. So what we've heard is that in some cases, the development that has come in is substantially higher than all the other houses on the block, kind of towers over everyone. And the neighborhood isn't quite impressed. I see some heads nodding, so yes, we've heard you. We've also heard that in some cases, not only does it tower over everyone else, but it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. There are elements associated with that development that don't quite look like everything else on the block. Again, I see some heads nodding, so you know, we've heard you. And in this proposed zoning bylaw, you will see some changes that will help us to try to ensure that the infill is contextual. Contextual. And so what we mean by that is that it takes into consideration the context of the neighborhood. What are some of the common things, common development standards in the neighborhood? What these regulations are not going to bring forward, but we can have a conversation about it. I'm not afraid. I've had it 4 other times, so we can talk about it, is architectural controls. So if the neighborhood is interested in actually regulating the aesthetic style and quality of the building. So say every house on the block has brick, and this new infill house has siding, and the neighbors are upset because it doesn't have brick as well. Now, the zoning bylaw does have a mechanism in order for us to do that, but that's not what these infill guidelines are going to do. These infill guidelines are not going to make every new house look like every old house on the block. What it will do is try to ensure that when new development comes in, is that it makes sense, it's contextual. Because again, we still have to acknowledge that Regina's changing, we have to accommodate more people in some way, shape, or form. How can we do that without destroying the neighborhood and being disrespectful to the character? So what you will see, 3 regulations. The first is with regard to height. So what we're proposing is that new development in existing neighborhoods will be required there will be a height maximum, and it can be taken either from the average of the 2 houses beside. So if I'm the new infill house in my red dress, the 2 houses over here, I can only go as tall as the difference between the 2 houses beside me, or 8.5 meters. So the reason that we've put in the context piece, so again, looking at the neighboring properties, is to ensure that whatever the context is for your neighborhood is taken into consideration. Because we recognize that every neighborhood in Regina isn't built of bungalows. Some of our newer neighborhoods, the houses are taller. And so telling that new house on the block to now be 8.5 when the rest of the houses were built to our current standard, which is 11 meters, is now creating infill that's not contextual. So we want to ensure that we're taking into consideration what's happening on the block. Another regulation you'll see in this proposed zoning bylaw has to do with the setback from the street. So as an example, I won't tell you where this house is, but we do know of a site where it was an established neighborhood, and the streetscape, all the houses on that block, had been built from 9 meters back from the sidewalk. And that was what everybody had had for many, many years. So there was a house that was taken down and a new one put up, but the new house was built to 6 meters. And so we heard some concerns from residents about that. Now, in that case, there was no violation. They had not violated any rules from a zoning perspective, because the minimum setback from the street is 6. It just so happened that this particular neighborhood had been built to 9. So while the neighbors felt that there was an issue here that needed to be addressed, there really wasn't much that the city could do because the person hadn't really violated any regulations. But again, we heard what the neighbors were saying. We said, okay, let's see how we can try to make this work a little bit better moving forward. So again, you'll see regulations that take into context the setback of the neighboring properties. Again, to try to ensure that that new house, maybe it won't be to 6, maybe it might not be to the exact 9 that everyone else is, but maybe it's at 8.5. So it won't be as jarring that it's so far out or so set back from the street, all taking into context of the neighborhood. The last thing that you'll notice in this proposed zoning bylaw has to do with infill, where the entrance is. So if you kind of think in your mind the last infill house that you saw. One of the reasons you may have noticed it is because all of the other houses on the block may have had an entrance at grade. And what we mean is, like, as you walked up from the sidewalk, you would walk right into the house. But that infill house, you had to walk up 7 steps, maybe another set of steps, and then you would enter into the property. We've heard from residents that, you know what, that's not what our neighborhood looks like. And we want to try to address that. And so in this proposed zoning bylaw, we have put in regulations that are regulating the first floor height, how far out that infill development can come out of the ground and enter into the property in comparison to the rest of the houses on the block. So again, we're trying to find a balance here. We recognize and we 100% respect that this is the neighborhood that you maybe raised your children in, your grandchildren come over and visit you on the weekend, and you want to preserve it, and we want to support you in doing that. But we also have to recognize that things are changing. Technology is changing. You've probably heard in the news and even heard at council about what is this autonomous vehicle going to do to how we plan neighborhoods? What if we don't have cars anymore? We just dial a car up and it comes and picks me up, takes me to the Safeway, get my groceries, and it takes me home. I don't even need a garage anymore. So just kind of keep in mind as we're going through this presentation that we're trying to plan not just for now, but 25 years from now. So if you can think about when this bylaw was first adopted in 1992, can you think about what you were doing? I was in elementary school. I'm just going to leave it at that. So I was learning to play the recorder. And if I think about how much has changed in that time, when I was in 1992, I still had a phone with a cord that you dialed and have this thing in your pocket. So just kind of keep that in mind. We're trying to preserve what we have, but we also have to prepare for the future. So let's look at Ward 7 and the breakdown. So I think some of you already have maps. And so these maps are for illustrative purposes, and my team's going to come around and distribute some for this for you. So, just so you know, the labels that are in red, so the side of the page that's with the red labels, the red zoning labels, are the current zones. If you flip the page over, you'll see blue labels. Those blue labels are the new zones. So just want to make sure that we're trying to give you the before and after. So, just so that we can kind of get our bearings and you can kind of understand what it is you're looking at, the western boundary here is McIntosh. This is Ring Road. Down here is Winnipeg. Here is Albert. Here's Elphinstone. Here's Pasqua. So you can kind of get a sense of where we're at geographically. So what you'll see is that the ward is primarily orange, and orange equals residential. And so the majority of the ward is on our lower density side. It's R1. So in that zone, you're only allowed to have detached dwellings. And on some occasions, we'll let you have a secondary suite. That's all that you can build in an R1 zone. Can't build a duplex, can't build side-by-side, front to back, can't build a townhouse, just detached dwellings. You have some other R2, which is, again, one of our lower density zones, but it allows you to build a duplex. You do have some commercial, and that's the blue, and that's along Albert Street. You have some other commercial activities. So right up here, I think this, is this Norman View Mall? No. Northgate, sorry, Northgate. So that's kind of where we're at there, so that whole commercial strip coming off of Ring Road. So that's where the zone is currently. You'll see a little bit of industrial, but it is on the lower end. It's our light industrial down here off the railroad, right here. So over there and down there. The yellow are our special zones. So they're made up of PS and I. So it's primarily the parks and the schools in your ward. There are a couple contract zones, and what I mean by contract zones are they were properties that at the time that they came forward may have had some unique development opportunities, but may have also had some constraints on the land. And so the city wanted to support that development moving forward, and so we created a special zone around that lot in order to support that development. Now, when you flip the page over and look at the blue labels, you'll notice that the color distribution doesn't change significantly. You're still primarily residential, and on the low end of that, our residential neighborhood zone. You still have your commercial in your mixed large market, mixed high along Albert, and you still have all of your parks and your schools. So you're not going to see significant shifts, as I mentioned earlier, in what is in your neighborhood now, but it's also an opportunity for us to talk about where we want to go. So let's talk about that. Some of the things that you'll see specifically in Ward 7. And so let me get through this slide, and then we're going to wrap it up, and then I'm going to throw it out to you. And what I want you to tell me is the things that you're hearing that you're like, I like that, Lauren, do that. But I also want to hear, Lauren, we're not ready for that. Because we want to hear both sides of the story. And we want to ensure that Councillor Bryce and her colleagues on council are also hearing both sides of the story. Because you're going to hear some things and you're going to be like, I like that. But then there's going to be someone in another ward who's going to be like, not interested. There might also be other interest groups who might have a different opinion. And so we want to ensure that, again, that council hears both sides of the story, because you're all familiar with the term, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if everyone is coming out and saying, no, I do not want those infill regulations, then that's probably we're probably going to get some direction from council about how we're going to move forward with those. We need someone to be telling the other side of the story, saying, no, I like those infill regulations, and here's why. We want to present as a balanced perspective as we can to council. So, 2-unit buildings permitted in residential zones. So as I mentioned earlier, Regina's changing. Housing affordability is a growing concern. Demographics of the community are changing. How can we flex, ebb, flow with these changes? So what we're proposing is that in our low-density residential zones that we would allow for 2-unit dwellings, whether they be duplex, front to back, side by side, only 2. So don't think of like, oh, we're gonna let a row of townhouses move in. Nope, we're just thinking 2 units. And why we're proposing that is because this isn't a substantial departure from what the density we currently allow. So again, I mentioned earlier, under R1, you're allowed a detached dwelling with a secondary suite. So 2 units. 2 units. What we're hoping to accommodate here is to create more housing choice, more housing options. So maybe everybody doesn't want to live in a basement suite. That's okay. But how else can we accommodate 2 units? So this is, again, proposed, nothing set in stone. Don't get all angry and send me an angry email. Let's talk it out first. That's why we're here tonight. 2 units in all residential low-density development. Second, we've removed the barriers to care facilities. So we recognize that, guess what? Regina's getting older, along with the rest of the world. So we recognize that we're going to have to accommodate an aging population. And, you know, these baby boomers, they're quite hip. They're not the type that's just going to get sent to the home. There are amenities that they're looking to have. Like they're not going to go quietly. And so how do we accommodate, again, how the landscape and demographic of Regina is changing? How do we ensure that those individuals can have housing that meets their needs, but also allows them to have the freedom that they've come to know and love? Secondary suites will now, we're proposing, be allowed in more building types. So as I mentioned, currently you can only have it in a detached dwelling. Can't have it in any other building form. What we've heard from residents is that we'd like to try it in maybe a townhouse. I have a townhouse with a basement. I'm not really using the basement, but hey, I could throw a suite down there. It might make my townhouse more affordable and it will give someone a housing option, maybe for a relative or family member. Secondary suites in more building forms. Garage width limitation. Okay, now this one has been a bit sensitive. So I'm going to walk you through it, and you can tell me whether you hate it or love it after. So basically, what it boils down to is that we're proposing that if you have a larger lot, you're allowed to have a larger garage. Front-facing garage. If you have a smaller lot, you're allowed to have a smaller front-facing garage. And if you have a very, very skinny lot, which has become common in some of our newer neighborhoods, you would not be allowed to have a front-facing garage. So why are we doing this, Lauren? Couple things, 3 things that come to mind. First off, we have policy in the OCP that talks about what a complete neighborhood looks like. And what it looks like is one that is not dominated by garages. Again, I see some heads nodding, so it's like, okay, I feel like that resonates with people. So when we want neighborhoods that don't, streets that aren't dominated by garages. Does that mean the garages get smaller? Does that mean they get moved to the back? What does that look like? So this is our first step. We don't have any regulations currently with regard to garage width, so we're testing the waters on this, and so we really, really, really need your feedback on this. I just lost my thought. It'll come back to me. Garage widths. Okay, second thing that we're trying to accomplish with garage widths. There is policy in the OCP that talks about an enhanced pedestrian experience. Sounds great. So basically what we're saying is that we want you to be able to enjoy walking down the street, because there are probably areas of the city that you love to walk in. And if they're not, we want to try to create some more opportunities for that. What we've also heard is that having a number of front-facing garages on the street can create some accessibility challenges. If you have a stroller, and you are, or if you're in a wheelchair and you have to move down that sidewalk, but every 2 meters there's this curb cut, you're dipping, and you're dipping some more, and try to navigate that in the snow. Doesn't create the greatest pedestrian experience, does it? So again, this is a test. We're trying to figure out how do we create these neighborhoods that are not garage dominated, are accessible to everyone, and create that great walking experience. This is where we'll be looking for your feedback. Zero lot residential development. This is another one that has gotten some good conversation going in some of the other communities. What we're proposing here is that if a lot was vacant and somebody wanted to put a residential property on it, they would be allowed to build that building all the way to one side of the property. They'd have to leave this whole other side open for green space. Part of the reason we're proposing that is we want to, again, encourage housing choice and housing options. Now, we haven't done zero lot development in about 40 years. And we've heard in some neighborhoods that, they're not interested in doing zero lot. And so we want to hear from all of the residents, like, how do you feel about zero lot? Because what we're hearing from some of our housing developers is that there are some new housing product that they'd like to try. They recognize that, maybe we didn't do so good at it in the 80s, but we want to give it another shot. And so we're putting it out to the community for you to tell us, are you willing to give it another shot? So we do have a handout at the back for zero lot. My team is looking at me like, oh, maybe we don't have it. Okay, well, we got the poster. If you wanted an actual handout, we can send that to you after, no problem. Just make sure you leave us with your email or contact information. So basically, there would be an agreement between you and your neighbor that would allow that property owner who built to zero lot to access your property to do maintenance on their side of the house that's abutting yours. So now what we've heard, I already hear some hee. It's all good. I've heard it all. Basically, this zero lot development can't go forward if you and your neighbor are not in agreement. So if your neighbor comes over to you and is like, hey, I got this great idea. I want to put in a zero lot development. And you're like, no thanks. Door closes. All bets are off. So we don't want anyone to think that someone can just put in a zero lot development. That won't happen. You have to agree to it. We need a legal agreement in place, and we would require that from the applicant to show it to us at the time of application. So it's not like it's going to sneak in somehow, and you're going to wake up next day like, oh no, they're building right next door to my window. No, that's not the way it's going to go down. It will be a legal agreement. Lawyers will be involved, so everyone should be informed. Now, we have had some other communities say, well, what if they try to finagle me? Like, what if I didn't read the fine print and the city should intervene? Those are definitely comments that you can provide us with if you have other suggestions or thoughts, or if you just don't like it altogether. That's okay. We're putting it out there for comment. Apartment buildings permitted in more areas. So this is OCP, in the OCP as well, that we want to encourage more housing choice, more housing options. And so you will see some of the barriers to a low-rise apartment buildings removed and allowing them as of right. When it comes to multimodal and allowing and supporting multi-modes of transportation, so we mean multi-mode, we mean things other than a car. So if you're on a bike, you're on a scooter, you walk, bicycle, we want to make sure that you feel comfortable doing so. And what we've heard in some respects when it comes to bicycle parking is that people might be cyclists, but when they get to their destination, there's nowhere to put their car. I mean, not their car, their bike. And the reason being is that under our current regulations, there are no across-the-board standards for bicycle parking in every land use, in every zone. So some zones you're required, some zones you're not, some land uses you are, some you're not. And so you kind of get this inconsistency. But for many people coming from other parts of the world, cycling is a main way of getting around. And so when they come to Canada, they're kind of shocked, like, I can't bike everywhere. So we want to try to encourage that people can use other modes of transportation. And one way we're going to do that is, if you're in a multi-unit building, in like an apartment building, we would require that you provide long-term bicycle parking. And what we mean by long-term bicycle parking is like a bike cage or storage area, because what we're seeing in some of the newer neighborhoods on some of the apartments is that I'm a child of the 80s, and I lived in an apartment when I was younger, and we had a storage room on the main floor. I don't know if anybody else had this experience. And that was where, the tenants put their tools, the kids put their bikes, you could put whatever stuff that you couldn't put in your unit. In newer apartments today, you don't necessarily have that same storage space. And so what we're seeing is that people are, rather than maybe putting their bike in the bike rack that's at the front of the building, they're putting it on their balcony because they feel safer with it being there than leaving it downstairs. And so we want to ensure that not only that the bicycle is stored in a safe place, but that it's not also having an aesthetic impact on the facades of buildings. All commercial uses are proposed to require bicycle parking moving forward, commercial and industrial. I know some people are like, Lauren, no one's gonna bike to Ross Industrial. But maybe they would if they had a place to put their bike when they got there. The last thing that you'll notice is that commercial zones are shifting. We no longer have commercial zones in this proposed zoning bylaw. We have mixed-use zones. And those mixed-use zones combine commercial, residential, institutional, employment, and maybe some even light industrial uses. So we do have some examples in the city where we have mixed-use buildings or mixed-use sites. We want to increase those opportunities. So I'm going to recap, and then I'm going to throw it over to you. So, key thing, the official community plan is our North Star when it comes to Zone Forward. We are aligning everything that we have proposed with the OCP, and we are making that very transparent. So if you go online and look at any of our proposed zones, you'll see a rationale document right beside it. And you can click on that, and it will tell you, item by item, why did we put in bicycle parking? Why is the setback set to this? Why is the height set to that? In some cases, you'll see that our rationale was, this was in the previous zoning bylaw, and there's been no indication that this regulation was a problem, and therefore we carried it over. As Diana mentioned before, this new zoning bylaw has roots in the old bylaw, because again, we have to acknowledge the history and heritage of these existing neighborhoods. And if we just obliterated all of those numbers, then you'd really start to see some new development, but that was completely out of context with what's currently there. The zoning bylaw is the main implementation tool of the OCP. It creates regulations and metrics that can be applied to each lot so that we can realize those OCP policies. And finally, the proposed zoning bylaw will impact new development. So new alterations, new additions, new development, not what you currently have on your property. So as long as what you currently have was legally constructed, it will not be impacted by this zoning bylaw. So the zoning bylaw regulates. What does it actually do? It turns policy into regulation. It identifies where certain land uses can and cannot occur. It also identifies what are the development standards? What are the land uses that are permissible, discretionary, or prohibited on a lot? And it ensures that what is there is complementary. Not the same, complementary. So we want to ensure that the things that may cause conflict between neighboring properties are separated where possible, and those that like each other and work well together are next to each other. Now, the entire presentation, this is my favorite slide because I get to tell you stories about when I was on the front line and I got this call one day. And so here are all the things that the zoning bylaw does not regulate. So, property ownership or tenancy. So the zoning bylaw does not prescribe that a house must be sold at a certain price. that it needs to be rented versus owned. The zoning bylaw doesn't get into that. Now, if you kind of research what is called inclusionary zoning, it's a tool that municipalities in other provinces have in their planning toolkit, where we can actually say 70 units of that building are going to be reserved for a particular price point for a particular demographic group. We don't have that tool here in Saskatchewan. So in our zoning bylaw, you will not see any regulations that will direct development to be a specific type of ownership. So sometimes we get calls like, is that apartment going to be rented or owned? The zoning bylaw doesn't have anything to do with that, so I don't know. So well, if you call and somebody says that to you, don't think, oh, those city people, they don't know anything. No, I literally don't know because it's not my business to know from a zoning perspective. Living conditions or property maintenance. So if you see a house, it's falling in, or there's that property that they just, for some reason, they're allergic to a lawnmower, they won't cut that grass. We hear you, not the zoning bylaw. We have the National Building Code, the building bylaw, and our clean property bylaw, sorry, community standards bylaw that can address those issues. The zoning bylaw isn't the tool. Cost of development or housing, so again, how much things should cost, how much a unit should be rented for, how much a building should be sold for, that's not the zoning bylaw. On-street parking, this is a good one. The zoning bylaw does not prescribe the stalls on the street to the houses on the block. So, you went outside and you shoveled that space right in front of your house, because that's where you like to put your car. I know, because you've called me and you've told me. You've called me and you've said, Lauren, I woke up this morning and someone was parked in my spot. Okay, well, your spot in your driveway? No, my spot on the street. This is a very sensitive conversation for me, because then I have to say that the street belongs to all of us. And as long as that vehicle is moving every 24 hours, there is no parking violation. So, have a nice day. So again, just want you to know that that parking stall on the street is not regulated by the zoning bylaw, but the parking stalls on your property are. Street width, sidewalk placement, walking or bike paths. We've had questions about this as well. Is the zoning bylaw going to give us more of these? No, because the zoning bylaw is not the tool that manages these pieces. We have other planning processes and design manuals that speak to these items. The zoning bylaw doesn't. Construction standards. So where your HVAC is, where your sprinkler system is, whether it's wood frame, concrete, all of those things are regulated under the National Building Code, not the zoning bylaw. Operating hours of businesses or clientele. Again, I've got some good calls from this. So maybe you live beside or across the street from a commercial property. And maybe they have hours late into the evening. Maybe they make some noise. We have a tool for that. The zoning bylaw isn't it. So we have a noise bylaw that does have requirements about when things can be loud and when they have to be quiet. The zoning bylaw isn't necessarily it. As well, if the clientele of that particular establishment isn't necessarily your cup of tea, the zoning bylaw cannot prescribe who can go into what establishments. So one of the key things that we as staff often say is that the zoning bylaw regulates use, not user. So keep that in mind. Goods sold or services provided. It's another great call I've gotten. So you've had a contractor come out and do some work and they didn't do a good job. And you're mad about it. And you want to call the city and talk to somebody. And I'm perky on the phone. Good morning, Lauren speaking. How can I help you? I had a contractor come in. He did a crap job on the concrete. I want to know if he's licensed with the city. Not in the zoning bylaw. We do have a residential businesses, but he's not a resident. So no. So just want to keep that in mind, that the people who are providing you with goods and services here in the city are not regulated under the zoning bylaw. There may be other associations, professional accreditation boards that regulate those types of trades or businesses, but the zoning bylaw doesn't keep tabs or keep track of that. As well, if a good or service is legal to be traded or sold in this province of Saskatchewan, The zoning bylaw has a legal requirement to accommodate it, whatever it is. So think of anything, some of the things you might not like. The zoning bylaw is not going to say you can't sell bubble gum. What it will say is that you can't sell bubble gum at that spot. You have to do that over here. So think of some of those things that people have been talking about lately, I will not name them, of goods or services that might be sold in our community now that people have a feeling about. Again, the zoning bylaw has to accommodate the use. It has to accommodate the use. It is not regulating the goods themselves. So keep that in mind. Last thing, most important thing, the zoning bylaw is not a guarantee. So if you go home tonight and you download your zone and you're like, Lauren, I don't like this whole stacked townhouse thing you're talking about, that's okay. You might see some uses that make you feel a little tingly. That's okay. Email them to me. We want to hear about that. But we want you to understand that the zoning bylaw is just creating the environment for development. It's not forcing development. So you are probably all familiar with the term location, location, location. So if your location is not the hot location right now for that type of development, probably not going to happen. There are a lot of factors at play when it comes to new development, and zoning is just one of them. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you see some things and you're like, not sure, it's not a guarantee. And as we already noted, it's not set in stone, so we can still have a conversation about it. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. Diana's going to tell you how you can further engage with us, and then we'll throw it over to you. Thank you so much for your time. I didn't see anybody fall asleep. Winning.